So, you want to own a funeral home. And on the surface, it looks like the most recession-proof business that has ever existed. The demand is not just steady, it is the only demand in the entire economy that is mathematically guaranteed. People die in booms, and they die in recessions. No marketing campaign creates the need, and no downturn eliminates it. More than 15,000 funeral homes operate in the United States, employing over 105,000 people and generating around $16.3 billion in revenue, with crematories and cemeteries adding several billion more. Roughly 75% are still family or privately owned. It looks like the definition of a stable, generational business. And yet, this industry is in the middle of a structural collapse in its core economics, one that is quietly bankrupting long-established firms. And it happens to be one of the only consumer businesses in America that required a specific federal law to govern how it talks to its customers. Both of those facts come from the same source, the single strangest feature of this business, which is the position the customer is in when they walk through the door. So let's understand that first, because everything else follows from it. The customer who cannot behave like a customer. In every other episode of this series, the customer has power. They can shop around, they can wait for a sale. They can walk out, think it over, and come back next week. That ability, the ability to say, "not today," is the force that disciplines every business on earth. A grieving family has none of it. Think through the position precisely. They have a deadline measured in days, not weeks, driven by biology and by the arrival of relatives. They are making a 5-figure financial decision within roughly 48 hours of one of the worst events of their life. They usually have no idea what anything should cost, because most people arrange a funeral once or twice in a lifetime. And critically, every decision carries an emotional charge that has nothing to do with value, because choosing the less expensive option can feel, in that moment, like loving the person less. That last point is the economic heart of this industry. In most purchases, choosing the cheaper option feels smart. Here, it can feel like a judgment on your relationship with the person who died. There is no other consumer market in which frugality is so directly entangled with guilt. And there's a further asymmetry. This is a purchase almost no one comparison shops, because the act of price checking feels grotesque while you're grieving. So the normal machinery of a competitive market, informed buyers comparing offers, barely operates. Now hold that picture, because it explains both how the money works and why the government eventually stepped in. Why a federal law exists. By the late 1970s, the Federal Trade Commission had concluded that this vulnerability was being systematically exploited. The result was the Funeral Rule, which took effect on April 30th, 1984, and was substantially amended in 1994. It is a genuinely unusual piece of regulation, and what it requires tells you exactly what was happening before it. The rule requires every funeral home to give you a printed general price list, the GPL, the moment you begin discussing arrangements in person, and to disclose prices over the phone on request without making you come in. It requires itemized prices for 16 specific goods and services, so families can buy only what they want rather than a mandatory package. It requires separate casket price lists, which must be shown before you're taken to see the actual caskets, because being walked into a showroom of merchandise before you know any prices was recognized as a sales technique, not a service. It requires disclosure that embalming is generally not required by law, because families were routinely told or allowed to believe that it was. And it guarantees your right to buy a casket from a third party, Costco, Amazon, a local woodworker, with the funeral home legally required to accept it and prohibited from charging a handling fee for using it. Read that list again and notice what it implies. Each of those requirements exists because the opposite behavior was common enough to need a federal prohibition. Violations carry civil penalties that now run above $50,000 per violation, adjusted annually for inflation. Where the money actually comes from. With that framework in place, here's how a funeral home earns. The national median cost of a funeral with viewing and burial was $8,300 in 2023, according to the National Funeral Directors Association. With cremation, the median was $6,280. A single-location funeral home typically generates around $1.09 million in annual revenue, serving somewhere between 113 and 200 families a year. The revenue breaks into layers. The first layer is the basic services fee. This is the one non-declinable charge the funeral rule permits, covering the funeral director's professional services and the firm's unallocated overhead. It is the only mandatory fee, and the rule explicitly forbids stacking a second one on top. No separate facilities fee, no casket handling fee, no administrative fee. That single restriction tells you those fees were being invented. This fee typically runs $2,000 to $3,500 and varies enormously between providers. And here's why it matters more than any other line. For a direct cremation, it often represents 30 to 50% of the entire bill. So the single most impactful thing a family can do to control cost is compare that one number across providers, which is precisely the comparison the situation makes them least likely to perform. The second layer is merchandise, and historically, this was the profit engine. Caskets, urns, outer burial containers, memorial products. This is where markup lived, and where third-party competition has bitten hardest, which is exactly why the right to bring your own casket was written into federal law. The third layer is professional services, embalming, preparation, use of facilities for a viewing, the hearse, staffing the ceremony. Worth noting, the average cost of embalming is around $775, and no state requires it as a general rule. It's a service, not a legal necessity, and the rule requires that to be disclosed. The fourth layer is cash advances, items the funeral home purchases on the family's behalf, like death certificates, obituary placement, clergy honoraria, flowers. Families are entitled to ask what the home actually paid versus what it's charging. And the fifth layer is the one that shapes the whole business: pre-need. These are prepaid, pre-arranged funerals sold to people while they're still alive, usually funded through insurance or trust. Pre-need is strategically enormous because it does two things at once. It captures the customer years or decades before the death, locking in future volume against competitors, and it produces cash today. A funeral home with a deep pre-need pipeline has something close to a guaranteed order book: the structural collapse. Now here's the part that makes this industry genuinely difficult right now, and it's the thing that separates this episode from a simple story about markups. America has switched from burial to cremation, and it has happened fast. In 2025, the U.S. cremation rate reached 63.4%, roughly double the burial rate of 31.6%. The NFDA projects it will reach 82.3% by 2045, a point at which cremations would outnumber burials more than 6 to 1. For an industry that was built almost entirely around traditional burial within living memory, that is a structural earthquake. And look at what it does to the revenue per case. A traditional burial service generates roughly $7,000 to $10,000. A cremation service averages $2,000 to $5,000. And a bare direct cremation can be $1,000 to $3,000. So the average revenue per family walking through the door has collapsed, while the funeral home's costs have not moved at all. This is the trapdoor under the business, and it's the same fixed cost trap we've seen throughout this series in its harshest form. A funeral home carries an extraordinarily heavy fixed cost base: a large, well-maintained building with chapel and viewing rooms, refrigeration and preparation facilities, a fleet of specialty vehicles, including hearses that sit idle most of the week, licensed funeral directors who are legally required and expensive to employ, and 24-hour availability, because death does not schedule itself. Payroll alone typically runs 25 to 35% of revenue, and total operating expenses run 80 to 90%. None of that shrinks when a family chooses cremation. The same building, the same staff, the same license, the same 3 a.m. call, for a third of the revenue. That's why net margins land around 10 to 15%, with strong operators reaching 20%, and why the difference between those outcomes is almost entirely about revenue per call. A funeral home doing 150 families a year at $8,000 each is a healthy business. The same building doing 150 families at $3,000 each is in serious trouble, and nothing about the building changed. How the survivors respond? There are three basic responses, and they define the industry today. The first is consolidation. Large corporate groups, Service Corporation International, trading as Dignity Memorial, along with carriage services and private equity-backed groups like Foundation Partners, have been acquiring independents for decades. The logic is straightforward. Spread fixed costs across many locations, share vehicle fleets and preparation facilities, and gain purchasing power on merchandise. But consolidation has a documented pricing effect too. When large chains absorb independents across a market, competitive pressure eases and prices often rise. One analysis by the Funeral Consumers Alliance found that the basic services fee at corporate-owned homes averaged 27% higher than at independents in the same metropolitan areas. The second is to sell cremation as a service rather than a commodity. The strategic mistake is treating cremation as a cheap disposal to be endured. The successful move is building memorial experiences around it. A full service with the cremation, better urns, memorial products, celebration of life events, keepsake jewelry. The goal is to recover average revenue per call by giving families something meaningful to purchase, rather than watching the ticket collapse to a bare direct cremation. The third is pre-need, aggressively. Locking in tomorrow's families today is the strongest hedge a funeral home has against both consolidation and margin compression. The two scenarios. So, does owning a funeral home actually work as a business? In the good scenario, you own a long-established firm with a genuine reputation in a community that has known your name for generations. That reputation is the entire moat, because this is a business almost nobody shops on price and almost everybody chooses on trust. You've built a deep pre-need pipeline that guarantees future volume. You've adapted to cremation by building real memorial offerings around it, rather than surrendering to the lowest cost option, so your revenue per call holds. You control payroll and keep your facility efficient. Net margins land in the 15 to 20% range. EBITDA, around 15 to 22%. And because demand is genuinely permanent, the business sells at a solid multiple, commonly around 6 to 8 times EBITDA, higher with strong real estate. In the bad scenario, you own the same beautiful, expensive building, the chapel, the fleet, the preparation facilities, in a market where the cremation rate is climbing past 70% and a low-cost direct cremation provider has opened nearby with almost no overhead, advertising a flat fee online. Your revenue per family falls by half, while your fixed costs don't move an inch. A corporate group buys 3 of your competitors and outspends you on marketing. Your pre-need pipeline is thin because the previous owner never built one. And you're operating a $1 million facility to serve families paying $2,000, with a payroll of licensed professionals who must be available 24 hours a day for a call volume that no longer covers them. The real lesson. Because here's the honest thing underneath all of it, and it deserves to be said plainly. Funeral directors do genuine, difficult, necessary work. Someone has to be reachable at 3 in the morning. Someone has to handle a body with dignity, navigate the paperwork of death, and stand calmly in a room where a family is falling apart. Most people in this profession are not predators. Many are third-generation operators who know every family in town and have sat with them on the worst day of their lives. That work has real value and deserves to be paid for. But the economics of the business sit on top of a customer who cannot behave like a customer. Someone with no time, no expertise, no ability to walk away, and a powerful emotional reason not to choose the cheaper option. That's why this is one of the very few industries where the federal government had to legislate that you must be handed a price list before you're shown the merchandise. A funeral home looks like a business that sells caskets and services. What it actually sells is the handling of something no one is prepared to handle, at a moment when comparison, delay, and negotiation all feel impossible. The funeral rule exists to give a grieving family back the one thing every other customer in the economy already has: the ability to see the price before